Good afternoon to all of you. Let me welcome you to the House of the Americas, to the building of the Organization of American States, to this very important roundtable that we are having this afternoon. The title of the roundtable is Milestones and Challenges in the Advancement of the Rights of Afro-Descendants in the Americas. And we have very important speakers, and we also have a great panel that is going to be discussing this issue. Without further ado, let me invite to the podium the Secretary General, who would do introductory and welcoming remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Deborah May Lowell, Permanent Representative of Antigua and Barbuda to the OAS, Congressman Gregory Meeks, Executive Secretary of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, Emilio Alvarez y Casa, distinguished ambassadors and permanent representatives to the OAS and observers and the observer countries. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to be here this afternoon in the House of the Americas on the occasion of the 48th OAS Policy Roundtable, a roundtable that we hold on milestones and challenges in the advancement of the rights of Afro-descendants in the Americas. I think this roundtable is really very timely because here in the U.S., the month of February is dedicated to Black history. And this year is particularly important as the country will commemorate various events that forged not only a nation, but set the tone in the struggle for equality and justice around the world. The Emancipation Proclamation of 1863, the 1963 March on Washington, we are commemorating the 50th anniversary this year, the beginning of the second presidential term of President Barack Obama, are all milestones that certainly are not only important in American history, but in the history of our region, of our continent. These achievements are the culmination of decades of struggles by individuals who believed in the idea that all men were created equal, set the tone for the struggle for equality and justice around the world, and centered certainly in our Latin America and the Caribbean also very strongly. I must remember to start with that even though the figures differ very much, the Americas is home to about 830 million people, North, South, Center, and Caribbean, of which about 1/4 is of Afro-American descendants. The two main countries in the Americas, the two largest countries, which are the US and Brazil, have a very large Afro-descendancy. Actually, in the past census, 51% of the inhabitants of Brazil declare themselves of how to be Afro-descendants. And that's quite a large number, and even though it's very diverse, and our countries are very different, as a region, it's a strength, a rich heritage that has helped to shape who we are and continues to shape us to this day. The advancement of the rights of Afro-descendants, therefore, goes well beyond that of race. It constitutes a continuing effort to bring about the full measure of justice to every aspect of life in the Americas. The continuous progress of our societies depends on it. The fight against discrimination and intolerance has been at the heart of the Organization of American States since its beginnings. Our charter proclaims the fundamental rights of the individual without distinction as to race, nationality, creed, or gender. More recently, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights has established that the principle of non-discrimination is one of the cornerstones of any democracy. The creation of the Special Rapporteurship on the Rights of Afro-Descendants and Against Racial Discrimination in 2005 is an effort to work with OAS member states to raise awareness and analyze the current challenges that confront countries of the region in the fight against racial discrimination. In 2010 and 2011, our assemblies of the Organization of American States in Peru and El Salvador adopted resolution that recognized the International Year of the People of African Descent, and then a resolution on the recognition and promotion of the rights of people of African descent in the Americas. Both statements, both declarations, reaffirm the importance of full, free, and equal participation of people of African descent in all aspects of political, economic, social, and cultural development in the Americas. We look forward to our very distinguished panel to shed some light on these and other questions, as well as to provide valuable insights that will inform our work and enlighten our audience. I want to thank Ambassador Deborah Mayo Lowell, Permanent Representative of Antigua and Barbuda, who graciously agreed to moderate this panel, and the panelists that are accompanying her today. Now, to introduce the theme of this public policy roundtable, it is my honor to give the floor to Congressman Gregory Meeks, who represents the New York 5th Congressional District in the U.S. House of Representatives, a senior member of the House Financial Services Committee, and also a member of the Foreign Affairs Committees. Congressman Meeks is a big supporter of democracy and diplomacy in the Americas, co-chair of the Brazil caucus and the Colombia caucus in the House of Representatives, and serves as the Congressional Black Caucus and on the Organization of American States Caucus, which is one endeavor to which he dedicated a lot of time, and he managed to create the decision to promote the decision to create this OAS caucus. That's why I was so grateful for him for being here and welcoming to inaugurate our panel. And I would like to welcome every one of you to the OAS and wish you a most productive roundtable. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Let me say on the outset, it's my pleasure to be at the beautiful building known as the OAS. It is absolutely one of the most beautiful buildings that is in Washington, D.C., and for what it stands for, bringing all of this hemisphere together, its mission is so important, and probably, in my estimation, more important today than it was when it was first created. And so I want to thank Secretary General Souza for facilitating this critical discussion at a critical time, I think, in our history. It is great to be here. Let me say, as I look at this distinguished panel, that I wish I would be able to stay here for the whole thing. Because I know when I look at who we have before us, led by our ambassador, that you are going to have a conversation that is tremendously important, that is long overdue, and will be very enlightening to all of you. And by the fact, I say this to a lot of audiences, especially of this caliber, by the fact that you are here, and what you will learn and hear, and the questions and answers that will come from this panel, you have a lot of responsibility. Because what is important is not what we just say here, but what we do once we leave here. Once you go back to home countries, once you go back into parts of the United States, what we do once we leave here is what really is important. And so you have to be, and I know we have other ambassadors and individuals who are part of the OAS and all of you who are, you would not be interested you would not be here if you were not interested in this subject matter. But we all have a responsibility to make sure that we strive to make this place that we call Earth a better place, not just for us, but for those who will come behind us. The reason I wanted to be here today is so that I could share a few thoughts on this issue, which is near and dear to me. I want to spend a bit of time talking about African Americans and our ongoing struggle, because I believe it is relevant to the struggle of African descendants throughout the Americas. More than ever, this is a shared advancement. And so I'm not excluding African Americans within the United States of America, because despite what some would think, we still have a lot of progress to make right here. And so let me start with a bit of historical context. Many of you are aware of the Horatio Algier stories and the importance of the Algier hero to the culture of these United States of America. You see, shortly after the Civil War, a powerful storyline became popular and ingrained in our nation's identity. The author Horatio Algier wrote rags to riches tales of young boys rising from severe poverty to the ranks of the rich and famous. It was a time when fortunes were being made, and the United States was the land of mobility, free of the fetters of aristocracy that much of the world had been used to for centuries. Most Americans believed that advancement was possible in this called the Great Industrial Age, if only one was prepared and would work hard. Around the same time that this storyline was forming, African Americans in the United States were forming their own connection to hope, mobility, and the promise of personal and community advancement. It was the historical period known as the Reconstruction that arose immediately after the Civil War. Many of you might have seen last night, didn't win Best Picture, but the picture about Abraham Lincoln. So right after the Civil War. And it was through which a now supposedly unified United States sought to enact a more perfect union. For blacks, the rags to riches trajectory wasn't attainable, or wasn't as attainable as it was for whites. But the community grew to understand that advocacy could lead to advancement. Leaders like W.E.B. Du Bois started planning a way forward, and education was at its core. In my lifetime, I've seen the African American community's vision of the Algier hero come to fruition. Sadly, though, I have also seen the speed with which that mobility, that rise into the middle class and beyond, has also begun to slip through our fingers. It is being replaced with the stubborn inequality that has long gripped so much of the Western Hemisphere. For blacks, the advancement of our rights has always been closely linked to what I call the 3 E's. To me, oftentimes when we're talking, we talk about empowerment, which is what I go. But you gotta have the 3 E's. I've always said that you can't really be empowered unless you first have education. Education becomes a critical part of empowerment. And if you have education, but yet you have no economics, there's nothing economic around you, there's nothing that helps propel you, then still you have a problem being empowered. So I have always said, being bad in math, my mathematical formula was education plus economics equals empowerment. And so, as it was then, the same is now true, as it was in America. We would not have a Barack Obama if it wasn't for his education, surrounded as a lawyer to help his academics, that helped propel him and empower him to be the President of the United States. If it wasn't for that, he would not be the President of the United States. And so what was true and is true for African Americans in the United States is also true for African descendants throughout the Americas. People of African descent in the Americas have seen, in my estimation, a remarkable proliferation of rights in the last 60 years. Those rights haven't simply been bestowed. They are the result of generations of effort, of strategy, and struggle. But the struggle doesn't stop at the establishment of rights or laws. Take, for example, Colombia's 1991 Constitution. It recognized the nation as a multi-ethnic and multicultural. Subsequent laws created institutional mechanisms to further the rights of minority groups, including reserved seats in the legislature for Afro-Colombian representatives. From that time to the more recent Victims' Law that has major implications for Afro-Colombians, there have been many laws, the establishments of many rights, but the advancement, the moving is still much slower. Afro-Colombians, like so many Afro-descendants throughout the region, in Honduras, Haiti, Peru, Brazil, are still disproportionately in the crossfire of violence, represented by high disproportionate marks: the poor, the underserved, the undereducated. A similar reality is true here in the United States, still. Different degrees, but a similar reality is here in the United States. As I said, yes, we have an African-American president, and yes, we have numerous African-American legislators in the Congressional Black Caucus here in Congress, and state houses all across this great country. And yes, we have legions of African-American doctors and engineers and lawyers and professors and scientists. But at the same time, at the very same time, 42% of black students were in high poverty, low performing schools just in 2010 and 2011 school year. At the same time, the very same time, only 6% of white students were in those low-performing schools. Disparity. The National Urban League reported last August that nearly all the economic gains of the black middle class made during the last 30 years have been rolled back during this economic crisis. For every $20 that whites have in wealth, blacks have $1. And that's according to the Pew Research Center. And the Center for Responsible Lending found that African Americans with good credit scores received subprime predatory loans 3 times more often than that comparable to white borrowers. So yes, my friends, we have a lot of disparities right here in this country. But I can still say with certainty that education is still a key component to a paradigm shift toward greater equality. Whenever I travel to nations in Latin America and the Caribbean, I emphasize the need to develop and empower leaders in marginalized communities. I push governments to include minorities in the highest ranks, to actively seek and develop leaders from within these communities. There can be no excuses. It's the same path that many took here. We talk often about Black History Month here, and we look at and recognize, but it was fights to make sure that there was folks in government who came from African American communities at every level of government. Educated communities and their leaders are better able to understand the rules of the game and develop strategies that move us forward. We talk about Dr. King, but we don't talk about the fact that he was educated first, learned and thought, and was able and had the ability to strategize to make the movement move forward. The paradigm shifted in my family. I was the first in my family to have a college education. So it shifted when I was able to get access to higher levels of learning. Thus, I believe in the glass is always half full. I hope that the paradigm is shifting, but we got to keep pushing on our hemisphere. There is evidence of it in places like Brazil, where a new law requires federal universities to reserve half of their seats for the underprivileged students from public schools, and most often attended by minorities. Now, that's important because some will say a lot of individuals, maybe even the President of the United States, might not have gotten into some schools that he would if it wasn't for affirmative action. People who had been denied opportunities, people who couldn't get in through the door. Because oftentimes, if you don't get that opportunity, you will never be able to progress and move through that door. So, as a result of my own life, as a member of Congress, I consider myself a guardian of the promise of social mobility. Not just for the United States, but for all of the Americas. As a member of the Congressional Black Caucus, I am keenly aware of what this promise means to the black community and what gutting it means to our nation standing in a competitive and globalized world, a much smaller and shrinking world than it was just 15, 20 years ago. I engage in that struggle every single day. This week, with this looming question of sequestration, my focus is on precisely that struggle for advancement. You know, President Kennedy once captured what's at stake when he said, if a free society cannot help the many who are poor, it cannot save the few who are rich. I hope that today's conversation will address ways we can all support the paradigm shift. It is critical that an organization, a great organization, like the OAS, play a role in this process. And you've recognized that by the fact that you're here. The work of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights continues to elevate the principle of non-discrimination in democratic societies. The Commission's report, The Situation of People of African Descent in the Americas, places the facts before us and reminds us of the work that remains for all of us to do. In an interconnected and globalized world, the progress of one nation is connected to the progress of the other. No nation can realize its full potential if significant portions of its population have no hope of achieving success. There is reason to believe that governments are beginning to understand and act in a unified way. There are examples and initiatives like the joint action plans between the United States and Brazil, and the United States and Colombia to promote racial and ethnic equality. I have seen the awakening in high-level officials who for years were in denial about the very existence of racial discrimination and disparity in their nations. I have seen Afro-descendant communities speak with cohesive and deliberate voices in ways that were only imagined just a decade ago. I've challenged elected officials to look at their own businesses that they had before they were elected, to see if in fact there was anybody of color. There was one vice president of a country, and I challenged him. He said that there was no discrimination in his country, that they all were equal. Now, I knew that he owned a big company. So I said, how many people of African descent do you have working in your company? Since there's no discrimination, since everybody's equal, How many do you have? So he said he didn't know. He'd go back and look. Now he came back and he was honest. He had none. Zero. Now, fortunately for him, it was an awakening. Because then he decided that he was going to put in place an affirmative action plan to make sure that he was giving opportunities to individuals. And he started not only doing that, investing in one of the African communities in their public educational systems so that they could then go right there to recruit students to come into their company. So I began my remarks with a view of the United States history because it is instructive for those of us involved with the ongoing push for the advancement in the Americas. It conveys how long this journey might take. It's been a long time here in the United States, and sometimes we don't seem to be as patient, but we believe from the experience that we have that you should not be as patient. How fraught with contradiction this struggle is. How turbulent the waters often are. And most importantly, our journey reveals that those fighting for the broad empowerment of historically disempowered people can never be deterred. Indeed, the struggle everywhere continues. I end with this. I just, yesterday, have my 13-year-old daughter. I wanted her and some of her friends to sit down and learn a little bit more about the history of Congress and the roles of African Americans in it. And one individual, I had this picture this video that I wanted her to watch because how effective he was in Congress by the name of Adam Clayton Powell. Now, Adam happened to be my congressman when I was just a little boy growing up. And Adam, as his focus was to make things different for African Americans. But the fight and the struggle and the things that people did to him when others were in Congress, expelling him from Congress, taking his chairmanship away, because he had power that could make a difference. Then I just fast forwarded, and I end doing this. Is all great in America? Well, I fast forward to just a couple of years ago. The person who replaced Adam Powell in Congress got too powerful like Adam Powell. He became chair of the Ways and Means Committee. And then they said, we got to take him down. So the struggle continues because they want to take him down. We are fighting right now with a president. If he says he wants to go to the right, they say they want to go to the left. No negotiations. I think that race still plays a part in it. But I leave with this conviction that people, good people, outnumber the bad. Good people want to make a difference. Good people recognizes the error of the past, and they will come together to make sure that we correct those wrongs. And because of that, in America, we have a Barack Obama, President of the United States, elected twice. Because of good people saying we're not going to let those who want to deny people opportunities to succeed. And so I am confident in all of the Americas. Good people coming together, countries working together. In the end, what Dr. King said not too far from here, that he's seen the promised land where all people, all of God's people, whether you're black, white, red, yellow, or brown, whether you believe in Christianity or Judaism, Buddhism, no matter what your religion is, that all of us will be equal and work together and make this place that we call the earth a better place for our children than it was and is for us. So I thank you for giving me this time to just share with you a few thoughts. As I said, I know the best is yet to come as I look over at the panelists that you have before you. You know, Zakiya Carr, I tried to steal her, you know, one time, and tried to get her in my office. You know, I know how good she is, and Mr. Lopez over there, he's been a long advocate in making sure and standing up, and the ambassador, she works so hard, knocking on our doors and fighting for folks. I know the best is yet to come. I look out at the audience and I see a number of people who are friends of mine, who we worked with over the time. I know where your hearts are. I say, let's do it. We can do it. We will do it. I again thank you, Mr. Nzuza, Chairman, General Counsel Nzula, for your leadership, for your insight, and for your making this happen. Together, we will overcome. Thank you. God bless you.
What a powerful statement. Another round of applause, please. Good afternoon. My name is Deborah May Lovell, and I am pleased to be the permanent representative of my country, Antigua and Barbuda, to the Organization of American States. In my capacity as ambassador, I strive to not only represent Antigua and Barbuda, but to speak on behalf of the voiceless. That would include youth, women, and the Afro-descendants. So I was very pleased when I was asked to moderate this panel. I'm very pleased as well to introduce the members of this panel. To my immediate right, I have Ms. Zakiya Carr Johnson, who coordinates with U.S. embassies in the region and interagency partners to support efforts to address race, ethnicity, and gender issues as part of the Department of State's social inclusion policy. For 17 years, Ms. Carr Johnson has worked with marginalized communities in Latin America and the Caribbean, and has also written articles and coordinated fora on the inclusion of ethnic and minority groups, economic, social, and cultural rights-based development, and diversity. Welcome, Ms. Carr Johnson.
Thank you.
To my left, I'm pleased to welcome Mr. Francisco Lopez, who is a senior management and policy executive. Mr. Lopez has had experience working with governments, private sector, and community-based development organizations. He has served as a presidential appointed advisor at the U.S. Department of State. Labor. For more than 20 years, he has led and executed civic, workforce, and economic development strategies, and has coordinated national and international policy development. Mr. Lopez attended the School of Industrial and Labor Relations and the Institute of Public Affairs at Cornell University. He also has a Juris Doctor from Howard University and has completed the executive program at Harvard's John F. Kennedy School of Government. Welcome, Mr. Lopez. I now want to just give some ground rules as to how we wish to conduct this conversation. We will have a general discussion of the topic at hand, and then we will then ask the panelists to answer certain questions. We will then open the floor so that we can have the audience be a part of this important conversation. I wish, however, to apologize for the panelist who was unable to make it. He unfortunately had health issues, and we wish for his speedy recovery. This is, of course, Professor Robert G. Cottrell, who was expected to join us this afternoon. In our discussion, we had heard from the Member of Congress about the general policy of the OAS to bring all the peoples of the hemisphere together. But he also mentioned that there are certain marginalized groups. And before I start the discussion, I wish to read from a commissioner who is the rapporteur on the rights of peoples of African descent. She is Professor Belle Antoine, and she says, "I'm very sorry that I am not physically here with you for this important OAS roundtable discussion during Black History Month. However, it is a testimony to the significance that the OAS would attach such importance to this subject as we proceed with this event. We at the rapporteurship are all too familiar with the debilitating effects of silence and indeed of denial. Whether it is that populations with Black majorities believe that numbers alone curtail prejudice, like in the Caribbean, or whether racism is rooted in Afro-descendants being a disadvantaged and forgotten minority, as in many places in Latin America, or whether despite having an historic Black leader, a powerful country is yet to fully confront its marginalization of many of the same skin color as in the United States. For us, the issue remains the same. We must continue to speak out and make visible that which is all too often hidden and misunderstood when we address issues of equality and justice with respect to persons of African descent. My rapporteurship is happy to lend its voice to this necessary cause and is fully committed to this task. Signed, Rose Marie Belle Antoine. So, with this in mind, I wish to start the discussion with the panel. Let us start with the question at hand. Would you be able to give some general remarks as to the question of the milestones and challenges in the advancement of the rights of Afro-descendants in the Americas? I start with you, Ms. Carr Johnson.
Thank you, Ambassador. I'm very pleased to be here today, and I want to actually acknowledge that there are many people in the audience who also work on this issue, so we should have a dynamic question and answer session, if not an internal debate, once we turn out into the audience. I see a number of people here seated. This issue is near and dear to my heart. It's not just what I do every day. It's not just the job I have, which I feel quite blessed to have. On a day-to-day basis, I get to look at issues related to discrimination, related to invisibility, and what we know, exploring all of the different experiences throughout the Americas of people of African descent, is that from the very beginning of the time that we came to these shores, there was a spirit of resistance. And you can't start this question or this discussion about human rights without talking about resistance and resilience. So without talking about our ancestors, or the people who first came to these shores, without talking about quilombos in Brazil, without talking about palenques in Colombia, without talking about Haitian independence, and without talking about Cimarron and Maroon strongholds in the Caribbean. When people began to think about their human rights globally, the universal concept of human rights, these communities knew they were equal. They knew they should be free. They knew they had the right, like anyone else, to be and to develop as anyone else. And I think the circumstances of colonialism, of enslavement, of the relationship that we created in this Americas makes the Americas a very interesting place to have this discussion. People of African descent in this region have been struggling since the beginning of the time that we've come here. And through struggle, we've been able to accomplish a lot. But I think as Representative Meeks mentioned, it is in the past 60 years or so that we've been able to see, through legislation, through changes in our court systems, some change happening. Longer too, but in the past 60 years, we've seen tremendous change happening at an extremely quick pace after the emancipation of slavery, which in this region, the last country to abolish slavery was actually, I believe, Brazil in 1888, and others a little bit before then. We definitely have to look at the advances we've made, not just in this country through civil rights and through the fight for civil rights, but also in more recent years in countries like Brazil with the new affirmative action laws, with the creation, for example, in Honduras of a new ministry on ethnic communities, Garifuna and indigenous communities, with new instruments that have been brought forward that people can utilize. However, we can't rest and be comforted and be content that that is enough. Anything that moves forward has the potential to also move back. And what we know is that it is a constant and ongoing struggle to move forward policies and practices and change culture. And that when we stop and we think everything is fine, very easily those things roll back. So I'd like to challenge us all to think about our ancestors, about the history of resistance and of resilience, and the institutions that we built to fight against that which would have kept us from having our rights in the first place. And then I would like to also bring up the concept of invisibility, which I believe you touched on a bit. It's the big elephant in the room. I won't color the elephant. It's the big elephant in the room. We don't want to admit it because I believe it hurts. I believe it's what is behind the inequality is not an easy discussion to have. But I think as we become more mature in our understanding of what does it mean to truly embrace human rights for all people, we understand that we have to have these difficult discussions. And that without the difficult discussion and debate, you can't grow. So I mentioned that I'm happy with the job I have every day. I get to work on issues of racial discrimination and inequality. And I get to work in some very innovative ways with countries in the region, but in particular, and I think Congressman Meeks mentioned, with Brazil and with Colombia. We have 2 action plans where we actually get to talk about these difficult issues. We talk about access to justice. We talk about environmental justice. We look at issues of race, gender, and access to education. And we're engaged on discussions around equity and access to health, as well as labor. And I think in those dialogues, this is the first time that we're having diplomats at high levels of discussion talk about race. And it's the first time that we're having diplomats have a dialogue with civil society to actually ask civil society, how can you help us and how can we help you? This is not just the job of governments. It's not just the job of a president. It's all of our responsibility to change the future. And you gauge the level of rights and the level of humanity and civilization of your society by the least of them. Those who have little or nothing. And if you look at what the face of inequality, what the face of poverty, what the face of injustice is in this region, it is the face of people of African descent and indigenous peoples. We've got to change that. It is the face of African descendant women and indigenous women and children. How do we change that? I'm going to just end there, and I think it's a provocative question you asked, and it's a provocative question I asked back, and I think we all here can help to answer that question.
Well, thank you so very much for giving us the broad view of how you view the question. And you have raised some very significant points, which we'll get back to on the importance of recognizing our ancestors, the elephant in the room, or being invisible, and the question of inclusion. I wish to go to the other member of the panel and to ask about your view on the general question, and to ask you to answer it as narrowly or as widely as you want, especially the measurement indicators concerning these challenges and milestones.
Thank you, Ambassador Lovell. First of all, let me say it's a pleasure for me to be here. This is a wonderful opportunity to really talk about some really important issues, and I'm very pleased to be here. Let me try to frame my response this way. I think when we think of the issues and the challenges and the benchmarks, milestones of Afro-Americans, I put it in the context of the iPhone 5, and I put it in the context of in the century of Barack Obama, the first African-American president. What do I really mean by that? So when I thought about your question, I think if I was talking to a group of Afro-Indigenous youth in Colombia and Ecuador, Peru, what would they say to that question? How would they respond to that question? And I think their response would be in terms of, let's start with the challenges, right? The challenges of Afro communities in the Americas. Not having running water, not having decent housing, and not being employable, or not being able to find a job. The issue of teen pregnancy, the issue of discrimination, of security, education, access to healthcare. These are all significant major challenges that exist in every single country, in every single community that we can think of in terms of the Afro diaspora. So the challenges continue to exist, to be there. When you think about the percentage of Afro youth that graduate from high school and those who actually go on to college, I mean, the statistics are incredibly dismal. So challenges for me are those challenges, are the challenges that I hear and I witness on the ground in these communities. They're challenges that continue to exist every single day as we're speaking here. Housing, food, security, shelter. So when I bring it back in terms of what are the milestones, how have we made progress? Well, I wouldn't say that there hasn't been any progress. I would say that the fact that we're having this conversation at the OAS with this panel is definitely an indicator of progress. I think the fact that Henry Gates just produced that series of blacks in Latin America for the first time ever, I think is an indicator of progress. I think that brings visibility to the issue. I think the fact that in Brazil, that one of the first black Supreme Court justices to be appointed to the court is a sign of progress. I think the fact that in this country, we elected the first African-American, visible African-American president is a sign of progress. Now, the question is, are these milestones, if you want to call it that, are they to suggest that we're somehow making way, or we're somehow truly making a difference or making an impact? I think that answer is pretty debatable. It depends on who you ask. I think the fact that we have a joint relationship with JPER, with the U.S. government, the Brazilian government, and the Colombian initiative, I think those are great milestones. But when Barack Obama became into the presidency in 2008, one of the things that happened in this country is that this country almost went into a major depression. Right? The economy was down, jobs, unemployment rise, et cetera, et cetera. What did he do? He said, we need a stimulus. We need a stimulus plan. We need economic development strategy. We need to reboost our economy. Well, I want to say today, and I'm hoping that this is one of the things that gets echoed in this room, that Afro-America has been in distress for hundreds of years. Isn't it time that we have a stimulus plan for Afro-America?
Okay.
Isn't it time that we really come together and really make that focused effort and help the Americas and the communities that we're talking about?
You've posed a provocative question, and I wish, therefore, to branch off from the question you pose to explore more fully the question of affirmative action. If you would therefore give us your thoughts on that, and then we'll hear from you on the issue. Could you give us your thoughts on the question of affirmative action then?
I had the privilege of listening to former Secretary Clinton speak to a town hall of students in Brazil at the first university founded by Afro-Brazilians, Zumbi Palmares University. And she was asked by a student, do you think affirmative action is something that we should be doing? What do you think about affirmative action? And her first answer was, talent is universal, but opportunity is not. And that when things are as unequal as they are now, and now I'm paraphrasing, but that first part was a quote. When things are as unequal as they are, it requires some sense of impulse, some sense of support, some additional push to get people to a level playing field. When you come from centuries of underdevelopment, lack of investment, invisibility, and lack of support, not participating in mainstream government, not participating in the halls of decision making, and not having access to education, how do you make that first critical mass of young people who will change the world tomorrow? How do you get there? It doesn't happen by magic. People can't just, make it there. How does the society invest? I mean, if you really truly think about it, how does a society invest in its next generation if it doesn't do something to stimulate the generation before? So the question, I think, is that should there be policies which help to move people to the next level? They're almost necessary to be able to make those types of changes in a quick way. And when you're talking about 50% of your population, or 23% of your population, or even 15% of your population, it is a disservice to your own society not to invest in that talent pool. You could be stepping over the next Bill Gates because you refuse to see the value of that person as an asset to your society. So when you see, and I believe, and I hate to quote statistics on specific countries, but when you see, and we are enraged when we say women don't have access to education, why are we not equally upset when we see ethnic groups historically marginalized from these same opportunities at the same rate, with the same percentages, and we don't do something to move that discussion forward? And then I would say too, what does the future of your business look like if your labor market and your talent is underdeveloped? Where do you get your talent from? That is a geopolitical problem that goes beyond the borders of our countries. How do you make business happen in 20 and 30 years? Where do you expect to be as a country? Where do we expect to be as a region if we don't invest in that population? And actually the population is 1/3 of this region. It's not 1/4. That's a significant investment. So how does it happen? I think we start first with policies, and they can be many different types of policies. They're everything from quotas, which we don't do in the United States, to special programs which help build pipelines to business or to a specific set of industries. Anything, as long as you do something, is going to be worthwhile and beneficial. So that's my...
Yes, thank you so very much. You had raised this question of affirmative action, and I would wish you to just give some examples, as did the other panelists, as to how you see this working in the hemisphere.
Well, I think I like to base things on my experience, and the word affirmative action is very, very American. Let me just say that, affirmative action. And I think even in this country, we're still grappling with what that really means. And there's a lot of resistance to affirmative action, even in this country as we speak today. So I think I agree with my colleague. While there are needed policies that have to be implemented in order to try to change the conditions and situation on the ground, I think that it's important to adopt the philosophy that one size doesn't fit all. Every country has its own cultural essence, so to speak. And I think that it could be an error to just, let's say, promote an affirmative action policy all across the region. Now, what do I mean? I mean that I think it's necessary to make sure that we have the right policies that would help us to see the change that we're seeking. It will help us to see the things that we want to occur. I'll give you an example of what happened in Colombia. There was, the US government put out some money to train Afro-Colombians, to train them in work skills training and so forth. And less than 1% of those that finished the program were actually got a job. Because the employers were still resistant to having Afro-Colombians in their stores. And this was done with a supermarket chain. There was still resistance to having Afro-Colombians in their stores. So for me, that's an example of where instead of creating policies or doing things that you think may result in a certain outcome, we need to really look closer and think, how can we make this demand-driven? So instead of being a supply-driven thing, how do we make it a demand-driven thing? In other words, how do we make sure that we have all the right partners, all the right players around the table to ensure that when we enact the policy that we think is correct, that it's actually being embraced by everyone that's involved in that circle, in that community. So that's why that's how I would approach that subject. I think affirmative action has been a good thing in this country. I think that there are things about it that are very positive. I think that we need to be careful of what approach we use in international context, and to make sure that we're using the policies that are correct
I think the mic went out.
for everyone.
Thank you so much. As you wait for your mic to be corrected,
Yeah.
I wish to ask your question, which was raised earlier during this discussion. You spoke about the question of the importance of our ancestors and also the question of invisibility. Let me first zero in on the question of our ancestors. In terms of the history of the Americas, in terms of the contribution of members of this community of which we speak, have you seen the contributions of Afro-descendants being recognized within the fabric of the broader history of the country? I raise this question in terms of trying to look at the image of the Afro-descendants in the hemisphere, which would therefore build on how the Afro-descendants are perceived as well. So if you would give me your comments on that.
There are some image people here who make films about this all the time. I'm hoping that they will respond about this later. Invisibility. It's very interesting how education and who shapes the way we learn dictates what we learn. If you look at most average history books that most average first grade through 8th grade students receive, not just in the US, but also around the region, you'll find that African history starts with slavery. There's no discussion of civilizations before, and there's no real discussion of much of contributions after. Perhaps I'm being a little overly critical, but I recall that in our books growing up, you had to take extra attention and extra effort to learn about African Americans that made contributions in the US. Carter G. Woodson was the founder of this month, which is Black History Month, was one of the godfathers of Black education and promoting African studies programs and curriculum. And one of his views was that we did not have access to our own history, and therefore it made it very difficult for one to feel pride in oneself, to even feel that one could accomplish anything, because anyone who would accomplish anything did not look like you, did not come from where you came from, and did not resonate with you. I don't think that that's absolutely true for every single person. There are always going to be intellectual minds who exceed no matter what, and people who, despite all odds and despite all challenges, rise to every occasion. But if you compound the lack of self-esteem, the lack of images of success, and the lack of opportunity, as well as discrimination, you have pretty much an equation for the lack of success for most young people. And even today, I see young people in our public schools who don't have access to information about their history, and it's world history. Yes, it's from Africa. Yes, it's about African American or African descent contributions, but it should be all of our history. So people don't know that there was a poet named Nicholas Guillen, and that Nicholas Guillen was Black, and that his art was an art form that was important to not just his own country, but to our entire hemisphere. Why don't we know about him? Why don't we have knowledge of his contribution? We don't sometimes even understand or know the types of inventions made, the types of agricultural advances that were made by people of African descent. We tend to have more access to music contributions and musical contributions. That tends to be where people put focus. Sometimes we talk about our contributions to cuisine. That is something that most nations are somewhat proud of. And when people talk about how we're blended societies of many different cultures, they will mention our contribution to the food. But we have to get beyond the contribution to the food. We contributed to the language we speak. We contributed to every facet of the societies that we now see, and we don't know it. And it's all around us. And what would the young people think and believe if they actually had access to real information about who they were? I think they could achieve anything. And now I'm not sounding like my government self, but this is really what I think. And I think it's unfortunate that people don't read and don't have access to real books about their history. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Now, if I were to ask you about the question of the image of young people, Afro-descendants, in the wider hemisphere, would you be able to give me some instances of how the whole issue of inclusion, especially in terms of young people, has been handled by your organization, or what you have done through your experience?
Sure. So let me try to address your question in two ways. First of all, let me say, when I started this conversation, I said, let me frame the conversation in terms of the iPhone in the era of Barack Obama. And this is the point about Barack Obama. Whether you support Barack Obama or you don't support Barack Obama, the fact that we have a Black president and a Black first lady and two Black young ladies in the White House has done amazing things for Afro diaspora across the Americas. I mean, young people truly believe that this country is the leader of the Americas because of that. I mean, that is significant to them. And because he has won a second term, that's even more significant to them. because there was all this wonder about whether that he would be there for second term. So whether you support him or not, the image of having him in the White House has done amazing things for just the consciousness of Afro youth, in the Americas, and people of color. I think sometimes even when I travel, and the fact that he's in the White House and I come from the U.S., it helps me. Even though there's no relation, So, I'm having a problem with my mic again. So my point is, I think that's really, really important. In terms of how they see themselves, there was a time when I think people were so isolated. There wasn't much communication between countries, between groups, communities, and so forth. Now, the iPhone 5, I mentioned the iPhone 5 because this is what I see on the ground. Technology has changed that, and it's continuing to change that. Social media, Facebook, all of these things are continuing to change those things. I mean, now young people across the Americas, Afro communities, see themselves as part of a larger group, part of a larger hemisphere, because they're linking up with folks in Mexico and Peru and Panama and the United States. They're connecting with organizations that are doing work with, for the United States. I have at least 2 or 3 Skype calls a day with folks from the Americas. It's amazing what technology has allowed us to do. So iPhone 5, an iPhone in terms of the concept of what it is, it has allowed our communities who were invisible before, and they still are to some extent, to be able to at least communicate and to network with the rest of the world. That has been an amazing transition. When you talk about media, before, media was what? Radio, TV, right? And if you weren't important, if you weren't a member of Congress or an ambassador, right, no one listened to you. But now with technology and Facebook and Twitter and all these things, the communication process has really helped elevate the identity and how people are seeing themselves.
Then thank you so very much. Now, on the question of communication, we wish now to hear from the members of the floor. So the floor is now open. There's a microphone in the middle, and we ask you to come up, identify yourselves, and also the organization from which you come. Just another housekeeping point. English, Spanish translations are available in both languages.
Buenas tardes, mi nombre es Gilberto Amaya y voy a hablar en español porque creo que la mayoría de la audiencia que nos está siguiendo habla español. Y muchas gracias por este espacio que ha abierto la Organización de los Estados Americanos para discutir estos importantes temas, y agradezco al panel por la discusión que han tenido al traernos a los antecedentes de la ancestría y las luchas actuales que enfrentamos. Sin embargo, yo creo que muchos estamos familiarizados con lo que son los desafíos y algunos logros que han habido hasta ahora, y necesitamos hacer una transición de la parte de discusión hacia la acción concreta. ¿Qué es lo que vamos a hacer para superar esos desafíos? Hasta ahorita pues realmente ha habido muy poco en ese sentido, y quiero mencionarles pues que desde el seno de la sociedad civil en Latinoamérica y otras regiones se ha creado lo que se llama la Plataforma Cumbre Mundial de Afrodescendientes, que es una coalición de organizaciones que ha creado una visión de largo plazo para la población que se basa en el desarrollo integral sostenible con identidad de los afrodescendientes, lo cual ha generado un eje de trabajo a través de 3 líneas. Uno es el promover que dentro de la OEA se declare el decenio de los afrodescendientes, siguiendo la iniciativa de las Naciones Unidas, para que tengamos un espacio donde se discutan estos temas no necesariamente solo en el ámbito de la Asamblea General o en la Cumbre de las Américas, sino que sea un espacio pues permanente. Y al siguiente nivel está la creación de un foro permanente de discusión y la creación de un fondo de desarrollo que permita equiparar un poco la situación y borrar las disparidades que existen entre las poblaciones afrodescendientes y el resto de las poblaciones pobres de la región. Entonces necesitamos socios. Tenemos una agenda y quisiéramos saber dentro de la OEA quién serían las contrapartes indicadas para que nosotros podamos trabajar y continuar la agenda. Lo mismo pues hemos tenido reuniones con Saquía en el Departamento de Estado y ya sabemos que ella es nuestra interlocutora allá, pero necesitamos a alguien dentro de la OEA que nos ayude a continuar este proceso y lograr los objetivos que estamos planteando. Muchas gracias.
Thank you so very much for your excellent suggestions. We will address them after. We will take 3 questions and then the panel will answer. So thank you. Next question, please. Your name and the organization.
Okay. My name is Roland Roebuck, and I'm a community activist. Understanding that all, I repeat, all of the Central Caribbean and Latin American countries harbor a high level of racism and white privilege, and that white privilege many times translates into who comes to our international organizations to represent the interests of Afro-descendants, and the numbers are very clear if you conduct a serious survey as to who is employed in all of these entities. My question centers along this line. Civil disobedience by oppressed people in the Americas, does it have a space in order to advance their interests, or are we just gonna sit down, look at reports, participate in conferences, and maybe in the next millennium, when our white representatives get ready to do something for our communities? Many of our communities are very sick and tired of this slow pace. So I'm advising those that are in charge of dealing with our underdeveloped communities to get with the program soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much for your question. Next question, please.
Claire Nelson, currently with the Institute of Caribbean Studies, and interest of full disclosure, former project director at the IDB that started the work on race and discrimination in Latin America, also representing ONACA, which is the Organization of Central American Organization, and African American 21 as well. On the issue of challenges, I agree that we have made some progress in that we're here talking about the situation. So, but it took us like 20 years to get here. So it was a long journey to get here. But the challenge is that we're still at the talking stage. As the first speaker said, the issue of funding. So I want to add to what he said as we move forward on the integral development path, which is identity, equality, empowerment, and equity. So I'm focusing on equity because I had to get that word in the language of the IDB, development with equity. So everybody remember that. Integral development, focus on development with equity. We're now talking about beyond 2015 and the MDGs. And the issue comes up for me is that I'm not seeing a lot of movement in Washington on the conversation. And 2, how can we ensure that the question of looking at development with equity as one of the sub-goals, or in the new design of whatever beyond 2015 will look like, how can we get this issue on the agenda, perhaps at the OAS as a beginning, so we can, or at the State Department, so we can get it begin to drifting into the organizations that matter in terms of funding, like the World Bank and the IDB. And second, can the OAS, for example, begin moving this conversation from the human rights sphere into your actual sustainable development department, so we can begin to look at some of the metrics that matter for the groups like the World Bank and the IDB. So we're looking at metrics, funding, to look at the next goals we can move towards collectively. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. So before we take the other question, let me first
ask you to address the first question, which deals with the Permanent Forum for Discussion and also a development fund.
I really think that that's a question for the OAS to answer.
No, in terms of even the State Department.
The idea of, you mean?
Yeah, the State Department.
I think it depends on where this forum will exist. If the forum is in which space, and I think I've had discussions with Gilberto Amaya, with Odeco, with others who've come to Washington and who are in constant discussion about the idea of the follow-up from the summit on people of African descent that took place in 2011. One of the strong proposals was an idea to have a permanent forum, an idea to have a permanent fund, and I think we all are needed to help think through where and when this should take place. I think no one on this panel really is going to have the answer, but I think he brought it up specifically so that it's on the minds of everyone here in the room, and that we can begin thinking in spaces like the OAS, in spaces like the UN, and in other spaces, international spaces, where would something like that fit? And discuss with more concrete certainty how it will exist. I think one thing that is still missing, and actually this answers Mr. Amaya's point, but also the second person, Roland, as well, is that without civil society, governments don't move. And the truth behind that is, without civil society being organized and concrete in what has to happen to make a society better, governments will be slow to move. That's how governments move. We are dinosaurs. We move with slow, deliberate steps. Sometimes we are pushed, and that's all I can say.
So if I could just ask you to touch on the question of civil disobedience, as was mentioned by the second person who posed the question.
Why me?
I mean, in terms of your experience, have you seen where this has been an effective way of proceeding?
Well, so I need to be very careful with this response. I think that what really works in the Afro diaspora, the Afro youth communities in the Americas, is educating people with the skills and the tools that they need to understand and know how to effectively participate in their democracy, how to effectively participate in civil society, in their community. I think you would be amazed how many communities, and even including the United States, how people are unaware of how government really works and functions. So I think that's my first, that's one of the work that we do in the region. That's one of the first steps, educating people to become more democratically involved in their communities by teaching them how to do so. And I think when that occurs, there's an awakening of si se puede, yes I can, yes we can. And that civil disobedience question that you asked me doesn't need to be civil disobedience per se, but it could be more active citizenship.
Okay.
So that's what we promote, more active engagement, more active citizenship. And I think that, believe it or not, and in some ways it can be considered civil disobedience, because if you're a member of Congress in Peru or Ecuador or Bolivia, and you have hundreds of people waiting outside your office every day to talk to you about issues, that could be considered civil disobedience. But it's civic participation. It's people are organized, they're educated, they know what their gender is, and they're willing to fight for it.
And can I add to that? They're willing to do it every day, not just once a year during Black History Month, not just during el mes de conciencia tal, but every day. if someone is, we know that lawmakers, and probably if Representative Meeks was here, he would agree, that when people call his office 15 times in a row about the same issue, he's going to start looking into that issue. He then puts pressure on someone else who puts pressure on someone else, and things begin to move. I think another issue you brought up was also using social media, and that we know that one email, one Facebook, one communication can lead to an entire campaign in one area or another. So how organized are we as a society to get what we want, if that's what we want?
Yep.
And that's all I have to say.
And just want to add one more thing. So in the case of the example with the supermarket chains in Colombia, I mean, groups of people can organize at these centers to ensure that the ownership understands that the lack of hiring of Afro-Colombians, women in these stores is unacceptable as a societal concern. Discrimination is unacceptable. So that's the way I would respond to, that type of question.
Thank you so very much. In terms of the last question posed by Dr. Nelson, thank you very much for your question, and it's something that we would certainly keep in mind as we craft the development agenda of the OAS. Again, thank you for posing that question. I will now go on to the second cycle of questions. Please, young man, step up to the mic. Thank you so much.
Muchas gracias. Yo soy Yuri Alexander Romaña Rivas. Actualmente laboro en American University, Washington College of Law, como asistente de investigación en la Academia de Derechos Humanos. Voy a hacer referencia específicamente a dos aspectos muy especiales, dos puntos muy especiales que me llamaron mucho la atención. Y uno es cuando Saki hablaba acerca de affirmative actions. Y considero que es muy fundamental porque hoy yo estoy aquí de pie frente a usted gracias a acciones que me permitieron acceder a ciertas oportunidades en la vida. Y entonces, en relación con eso, quiero hablar acerca del programa Martin Luther King, que es un programa financiado por el gobierno de Estados Unidos, la Embajada de Estados Unidos en Colombia, que le ha permitido a muchos jóvenes afrodescendientes poder adquirir el dominio del idioma inglés y de esa manera poder competir por scholarships en Colciencia, Colfuturo, Fulbright y poder venir a los Estados Unidos o a otros lugares del mundo a realizar estudios de maestría y doctorado. Lo que quiero demostrar con esto es que ciertos tipos de políticas que pueden estar orientadas a generar mejoras específicas en grupos que han sido marginalizados pueden tener frutos. Yo soy del Chocó, que es el departamento más pobre de Colombia. Yo no me imaginaba a sí mismo tener la posibilidad de aprender inglés en el Chocó, en Quibdó. El Colombo Americano envió a los profesores cada fin de semana para que nosotros pudiéramos tener acceso a profesores nativos que nos pudieran enseñar buen inglés y nosotros pudiéramos ser competitivos. Al cabo de los 2 años yo pude aplicar a una beca Fulbright y pude obtenerla. Aún siendo yo el mejor estudiante en mi universidad, aún teniendo el promedio más alto, para competir por una beca Fulbright tú necesitas saber inglés. No se trata de competencia, se trata también de habilidades. Y una de esas habilidades que se necesita es el idioma inglés. Entonces yo creo que ese tipo de acciones afirmativas, ese tipo de acciones puntuales que tienden a mejorar las condiciones particulares de una comunidad son necesarias. De una u otra manera no vamos nunca a equiparar el campo de juego. Y siempre va a existir esa brecha y tenemos que empezar a cerrarla. El segundo aspecto es con relación a el tema de la organización de la sociedad civil. Pero yo he estado pensando mucho acerca de eso y es que las personas, hablamos de un mundo ideal donde las personas se organizan y pueden participar activamente en la democracia, exigir el respeto por sus derechos. Porque nosotros tenemos sociedades, y en esto me voy a referir específicamente a Colombia, donde los líderes afro están siendo asesinados diariamente. Donde las personas que se organizan para reclamar sus derechos están siendo asesinadas diariamente, donde las organizaciones de base están siendo amenazadas diariamente. ¿Cuál es la respuesta de esas comunidades para defenderse frente a esos hechos? Cuando existe un Estado que no está preocupándose por responder efectivamente a esas necesidades. Nosotros les exigimos a las comunidades, organícense y exijan sus derechos, pero cuando ellas lo hacen existe una represión para que no demanden el respeto por sus derechos, no puedan garantizar el respeto por sus tierras ancestrales, no se puedan movilizar dentro de sus propios terrenos, se les desplaza para que se realicen o ejecuten proyectos de alta explotación minera que afectan el ambiente. Entonces, ¿qué hacen estas sociedades? Si realizan resistencia, son tratados de que están favoreciendo grupos al margen de la ley o que están obstruyendo el desarrollo del país. Entonces esta medida, se vuelve incomprensible y me gustaría escuchar cuáles son sus percepciones acerca de eso, cómo ustedes ven este asunto, porque solamente no nos podemos quedar en la retórica, sino mirar acciones que permitan realmente cambiar ese status quo, porque de otra manera las personas no se van a organizar porque están intimidadas y de una u otra manera no van a tener cambios sustanciales en nuestras sociedades. Gracias.
Great, thank you for your question. Yes? Next question,
Hi, good
please.
afternoon.
Good afternoon.
To those whom I know and don't. My name is Allison Moses. I'm president and founder of RICA Diaspora, LLC, whose mission is capacity building. I'd like to pick up on a couple of points that were made, not to overturn them, but to put a different twist and possibly turn them on their head. The first is invisibility. I had the occasion with Gilberto Maia a few years ago to represent the African Union in 4 different countries. I myself went to Suriname, Trinidad and Tobago, Guyana, and Brazil, where I grew up. And the issue of invisibility, I fully understand in terms of the mainstream use of the word, no access to the corridors of decision-making. However, I would like to share with you that invisibility is not necessarily the case. We Afro-descendants, according to the 4 countries and the people with whom I met in those 4 countries, are visible. Our visibility has been couched in a framework of negative visibility, if you will. Thus, I turn it on its head. My question in the Hall of the Americas, in the House of the Americas, how can we overturn this negative image? I could further disaggregate this and say that in Brazil, for example, in this very country, and in a meeting in which I worked right here in the House of the Americas, we understand that the corridors of the penitentiaries and so on and so forth are filled by and large with Afro-descendants. So the issue becomes, how do we, not having necessarily access, even in today's world in the 21st century, to the decision-making corridors, okay, revert the image? And I put that question here to those who work in this House of the Americas. The next thing is, I'm going to quote you, Zakia, and the issue of not having access to books. Of course, we have access to books. We have, as you say, we're in the iPhone 5 generation. So I posit to you, to all of us here, that we have a special job as Afro-descendants who came not as slaves, but who has, as our dear colleague says, Sheila, we were enslaved when we got here. So our job, I suggest, is that we within our families move outside of the box of the general mainstream media and promote within our families. That's our special job, because we are special, and I call it RICA Diaspora. RICA, as you all know, means rich. Hika, RICA, rich diaspora, because we, before we were enslaved, had a long history of wealth and skills. So my point here is, in a question, how will the organization move forward to, on a micro scale, promote our reading within our families and have that transcend the general media so that it becomes our mainstream, and that our children will latch onto that and not onto bling, okay, and understand, delve into their history, and then share it with others. So in conclusion, I have 2 questions. How will this organization change the image, which has been cast negatively and is not one of invisibility, but rather negative visibility? And how will this kind of organization, which has 34 members, my last count, be able and move to promote our learning of our own history? Thank you.
And the final question in this cycle, please. Please. Yeah.
Buenas tardes.
Buenas tardes.
Mi nombre es Julio César Huiti. También soy miembro de la plataforma de la Cumbre Mundial Afrodescendiente. Primeramente quiero agradecerles a cada uno de ustedes por la destacada participación que ha tenido. Igualmente queremos agradecer al Departamento de Asuntos Internacionales de la OEA por haber organizado este evento. Viendo a los desafíos y oportunidades que tenemos como afrodescendientes, nosotros hemos identificado que entre estos desafíos están aquellos relacionados con la energía y el cambio climático, las industrias extractivas y las desigualdades sociales que tenemos en la región de América Latina. Hasta el sol de hoy, América Latina se sitúa como el continente más desigual de todos. Si ustedes pudieran enviarle una recomendación ejecutable a cada uno de los 34 miembros que semanalmente se reúnen aquí, en este edificio, con relación a estos 3 puntos y las comunidades afrodescendientes, ¿cuál sería esa recomendación? Gracias.
I'm sorry, I missed the other 2 points. You wanted to find out about climate change, energy, and what's the other point?
With regard to climate change and energy,
yes,
extractive industries,
yes,
and inequalities in the Latin American region.
Okay.
Actionable recommendations that they could give to each of these 34 countries representatives that meet in this building on a weekly basis.
Thank you so very much. Now that completes the second cycle, but if I could use the if I could use the position of chair just to answer the questions pertaining to the OAS. The OAS is an organization in which representatives speak on behalf of their governments. In terms of the question of climate change and energy, this has been climate change has been an ongoing discussion at the OAS. And there is a department within the OAS that deals with the question of climate change. So what I would commend is that you go on the OAS website and see the work that has been done in this regard. If you have any other suggestions, we would certainly like to hear from you if there are any other areas in which you think we ought to be having this discussion around climate change. But climate change and energy is being discussed at the OAS. In relation to the second part of your question, the question of Afro-descendants, or inequality, that certainly is one of the reasons why we are having such a forum today, for us to start a discussion on this. I had mentioned to you that my delegation, Antigua and Barbuda, has taken up this challenge of making the concerns of Afro-descendants in the hemisphere known throughout the Americas. There is a rapporteurship at the moment for the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, and that certainly they certainly discuss the whole questions of inequality. Perhaps what might be useful is that I would be happy to see you after the discussion, so I may introduce you to those persons who might be able to assist you in that regard. Yeah. Is there any other question you wanted answered? No? That's very well. Now, in terms of the other question, the second question asked about the OAS in visibility and reading. What we hope to do, what we do at the OAS as well, is to promote education. That falls under the development realm, and ensuring that the development agenda includes the education of our peoples is of paramount importance to the OAS. If we were talking about having a separate entity which goes out to ensure that literary skills are possessed by the youth of the hemisphere, that certainly is a different conversation, which I'm sure we would like to have. So in terms of the OAS, as you know, education is one of the pillars in the development agenda, on the development agenda. The question of teaching literary skills is certainly an aspect which we could certainly take into account. I hope that answers the question. Now, in terms of the first question posed, the threats posed to civil societies that dare to stand up. if you could give me some background from your experience and how we might overcome this.
The threat posed to?
Yes, the first question asked about the threats posed to civil societies when they demand their rights. And so I wish to hear from your experience whether or not you have come across this and what can certainly be done so as to protect the civil society members who dare to stand up to ask for their rights.
Yeah, that's, unfortunately, that is, has always been an issue that comes up working in the region. People being afraid of advocating their rights or demanding things because of, they're for the disappearing, because it has happened and does happen. I think that the way that to approach that issue is, and what we have seen in our experience is that if you organize as a group in your community, you become a much stronger voice. You become a much stronger entity. You create alliances with everyone in your community that supports your issue. Now, this is very important. One of the issues that we always advocate and always advise is you never organize around race. You never organize around race. And yeah, the audience went quiet, right? Because the issue is you want to organize around issues. Because the issues that you care about, they may come out, they may exist because of your race and because of who you are as a person. But if you organize around issues, then you'll be able to find alliances with others that may not be Afro, may be indigenous, they may be Anglo, they may be other races that identify and want to support you in that effort. I think the mistake that sometimes people make is that you organize solely around race. And while race is a dominant factor in your issues, you want to organize around the issues that are important to you. And anyone who wants to support that, truly wants to support that, should be welcome to support that.
Thank you so very much.
I'm going to disagree with my panelist colleague.
It's a conversation, so please.
Yeah, if we can, let's spice it up a bit. I think that because perhaps in the US we're in a different space and alliance building has a different meaning, when you're in an environment where the mere self-identification, the identity of who you are is politicized, I think it runs counterproductive to the role of some organizations in themselves. So they exist to help to raise awareness of who they are, because in some countries people still don't know who they are. I think we have a distinct context in the United States where most people of African descent know their African descent from the day they're born. And so organizing around a lot of other issues can be advantageous, especially when you're a minority. And in the United States, we are a significant minority, but we're still a minority. If you're organizing in Brazil, for example, you may not have to not organize around race because you're 51% of the population. That particular advice may not work. I'm not saying that that doesn't mean that what you're saying can't be true. And actually, many African descendant organizations have coalition building exercises on a daily basis with the gender movements, with women's movements, with youth movements, with landless movements, because they do overlap. So I think you can do both, depending on what your understanding of what your struggle is. And I leave it open to whoever sees fit to come up with a strategy for advocacy. But I'd like to also say that in my previous life, I was also a human rights advocate. And one thing I found powerful when people felt they'd lost hope at home was utilizing regional mechanisms and international mechanisms to amplify the voice of people. That you aren't just in your tiny community in an isolated place alone, but that you share and can share the experiences of your community, the human rights violations that you are confronting every day with others around the world who have confronted similar or come across similar situations. So utilizing the Special Rapporteurship on People of African Descent, utilizing the Commission, understanding how the Commission works, understanding how the court works, understanding how the United Nations works, is helpful in raising awareness and visibility of human rights issues that are happening in a pueblo. And that, yes, people can and do die, and yes, people can and are in horrible situations, but that one thing that I find hopeful about human beings overall is that we don't have a tolerance for it when we begin to hear it over and over again. It is difficult to know that these things are happening and no one is doing anything. So raising the awareness of the people in the world about the issue, even in your tiny country, in your tiny town, in a tiny village, makes all the difference in the world. And utilizing social media can be very helpful in raising awareness as well. You may not even need other vias to get your point across because you can speak directly to people. And I think we've seen that happen around the world in different places, and I won't go into the different countries where that's happened, but yeah, stopping struggle because you're afraid that people are going to be punished is not the answer.
Yeah, so I think I completely agree with you, and I don't think we're disagreeing.
Right.
Let me just be clear. I think the nucleus of why we organize is because of our race, because of our identity, because of who we are. But the issues that affect us are lack of employment, social issues, healthcare, no housing, lack of education, lack of opportunities. Those are the issues we organize around. So we need to be as inclusive as possible to the groups and to the community and to the larger community out there that support those issues for us. So that's what I'm saying.
Well, this of course illustrates the complexity of the problem. Now, time is not our friend. Do we have extra time or must we close at 5 o'clock? Anyway, as we await the housekeeping matter, let's take the next cycle, please. You have the floor.
Thank you. My name is Robert Esprilla. I'm from Colombia, South America, from Chocó. And I'm here delighted that you guys are having this panel discussion because I think it's timely. I see Zakia Carr-Johnson, who's been in this struggle with us for a long time, and many African Americans and Caribbeans have been very helpful in this struggle in the DC area. I mean, thank you. And I see somehow that Zakia made a mention of things being rolled back. And in Colombia, things are being rolled back. The progress that was made, or the little progress that was made, is now being rolled back in Colombia in many ways. And I think that part of it is funding. So when Francisco Lopez talked about some sort of stimulus, I would say maybe a Marshall Plan. It's deep. We need a Marshall Plan for Black Latin Americans because without the money, communities can't organize, and civil society gets drowned out. There's no funding for civil society to do their work. And so you can't expect the government's going to do the right thing because they're just good. It's not going to happen. So there needs to be some funding for civil society. And I think I'm glad to see the ambassador here because Black people in Latin America don't have as much access to these kind of organizations when mestizos or the white Colombians or white Latin Americans are running it, because there's no feeling there. So I'm glad to see you in the position you're in, and hopefully you can be our voice in the inside because we need that desperately.
You can count on me.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Now, time is not our friend. What we could do, since we only have 3 minutes to go, we could just certainly hear the questions and maybe answer them in a very generic way. But what this emphasizes, that there is need for more of these fora to take place. Yeah. And we will certainly speak with those who organize these events so as to make sure they are not only celebrated in February, Black History Month, but that there is
these fora organized throughout the year. The first questioner did raise the point that there should be a permanent space for discussion, and seeing the interest generated this afternoon certainly does illustrate that. So again, thank you very, very much. We will hear the questions, and we will certainly try to wrap up. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Madam Chair, my name is Hubert Charles, and I'm with the Embassy of Dominica. I'm going to lift this because the gentleman behind me is even taller than I am. Madam Chair, I'm wondering whether there is a likelihood that the strategies that we have been adopting for promoting change in the Afro-American descendants community is a little misplaced. And let me just remind you of some of those milestones that you referred to. Abolition of slavery, independence of Haiti, the Human Rights Convention, Civil Rights Act here in the United States. You can go through them, and very likely what you will see is that most of them are political. And the question, and somebody I think hinted at it, in fact the gentleman who spoke before me, hinted that some of the political achievements that you realize can be rolled back. The same, I think, applies to a topic that you just discussed a little earlier. So I'm wondering whether we have paid insufficient attention to economic empowerment as a strategy for change. So I am hinting at there are a variety of strategies, but some are more strategic than others. And you talked about us being one third of the population of the hemisphere. That is a hell of a market. What if we started speaking in terms of a market, meaning a capacity to sell and to buy, to produce? In other words, I'm saying we have this tendency to believe that the strategies that were effective over the last 50 years will continue to be effective. Okay. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't be political. I'm not saying that we should not have these various manifestations of dissatisfaction. I am simply saying that we need to give thought and always question the previous strategies and to determine whether we should not apply new ones, and whether among those new ones should not be not just technology, which was referred to earlier, but also economic empowerment as not just in terms of participation, but as a bloc, as a cultural entity.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. We give the mic to the ambassador from Haiti.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good afternoon, everyone. I know the translator is almost running out of time, though, therefore I'm going to be very short. I don't have really questions to ask this afternoon, just only a little remarks, particularly with regards to the Haitian Revolution. I believe Mrs. Carl Johnson mentioned it at the beginning, but unfortunately when we talk about education, we strongly believe this issue, the importance of the Haitian Revolution, never mentioned anything whenever you're talking about black history. I don't know why, because probably it hurts when they mention it, or because probably it was a group of slaves who dared to do something like this, who dared for the first time to break the chain of slavery. We believe it is very important to be mentioned. Whenever we're talking about black history, we cannot talk about black history without mention the Haitian Revolution, particularly with the history of the United States. Even before our own revolutions, we came here in Savannah, Georgia, fought alongside those Americans. And 27 years later, who blocked us? Because as the former US president said, those guys, we need to divide them. Otherwise, they're going to be a very, very big threat for the United States. Because we wanted to expand the freedom, to give the chance to every other African Americans or any other blacks and everywhere in the world, any other races, as we did with Simon Bolivar. Because the issue is they don't want to mention it. Recently, last year, it was a shock to me here at the OAS. They were celebrating the anniversary of Simon Bolivar. none of the speakers, none of them mentioned the help of Haiti. When Simon Bolivar came to Haiti, when we gave him everything, and they never mentioned that. I mean, it was just a way to tell you that we as Haitian, particularly me as Haitian, I mean, this is really disturbed me. Whenever I go everywhere, they're talking about the black history or blackness or everything. They never mention Haitian revolution because we dare to break the chain of slavery. It is very important to be noted. It is very important to be mentioned. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Fati. I am pleased to give the floor to the Ambassador of St. Kitts and Nevis.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Lovell, and I'd like to express my profound gratitude to the panelists. I'm Jacinth Henry Martin, Ambassador of St. Kitts and Nevis, and I want to mention another elephant in the room that I don't think has been mentioned and which we are very reluctant to mention as a rule, and that is, in addition to feelings imposed inferiorities, the ones that we impose on ourselves. It goes from thinking that we are less capable, that we are less able, to actually denying that we are of Afro origins. There are people who don't exactly look like me, who are Afro descendants, who have decided to opt out. And then we have, in current day society, people who have chosen to decide who is more or less Afro-descendant based on the shades of our color. And so what strategies really can be employed to determine that we all are Afro-descendants, and how much this would empower us as a people if, rather than breaking ourselves down into very minute little segments of society, we embrace each other, believing in ourselves and our capacity, and witness what that level of self-sufficiency can bring to society. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for raising the question of identity. I give the floor now to the representatives from St. Vincent and the Grenadines.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, and thank you very much to the panelists for very wonderful presentations. I'd like to pose a question that takes the discussion into a different direction, because we've dealt with civil society and how civil society can make an impact. But we haven't looked as yet at how it is that as governments we interface with one another. You have the situation of Haiti, where a slave people decided that they had enough, and they stood up and they got independence, and the response from the international community was to straddle them with a crippling debt that had them incapable of developing themselves for years. And then there's a recent story in the Caribbean, the English-speaking Caribbean as a whole, where these countries, after they came out of colonialism, struggled to find niches, economic niches where they could produce and advance themselves. For the Windward Islands, where I'm from, we started planting bananas, and it started during the World War, and we were supplying England, and up until the 90s, we were, the 4 countries of the Windward Islands, supplying 3% of the market in the UK. And we were taken to the WTO, and this was whittled down to nearly nothing right now. We've had to change, so we went to International Financial Services, and the international community again pounced on us for that and said that we were promoting offshore tax havens, and we were blacklisted and grey-listed and all sorts of lists. Then we, other countries, went into more innovative ideas using the communication sector, using the internet to do gaming and so on. And laws were passed in the developing world forbidding their own nationals to partake in gaming on the internet across borders. Everywhere we seem to go to find our own economic space where we can grow, where we can look after our own people, we are smacked in the face each and every time. Why don't we look at the issue of how governments relate to one another? And is race an issue? Thank you.
Thank you so very much for that provocative question. I now give the floor to the First Secretary of Antigua and Barbuda.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and a wonderful job it is you're doing of moderating this panel. For those of you who do not know,
I'm a member of my staff. Thank you.
I am Joy D. Davis Lake. I am with the Embassy of Antigua and Barbuda, but I have the distinct honor of chairing the OAS working group to draft legally binding inter-American instruments against racism, racial discrimination, and all forms of intolerance. And with respect to that chairmanship, I have questions for Zakia and Francisco. The draft Convention on Racism attempted to address the issue of Afro-descendants in the region. And I will read the article that was proposed in the original draft convention. The state parties to this convention recognize the collective rights of indigenous peoples and, when pertinent, of persons of African descent that are indispensable for their existence, well-being, and integral development as peoples inter alia, their right to their collective action, to their social, political, and economic organization, to their legal systems, to their own cultures, to profess and practice their spiritual beliefs, and to use their languages, and to administer, make use of, and control their habitats and natural resources. A very strong constituency of member states vehemently opposed the mention of Afro-descendants in this draft convention. Their reason was that there is a multiplicity of ethnicities and people of indigenous descent, etc., and it would be politically inexpedient to mention one group. Were you, Zakia or Francisco, at the working group on this day? What would be your advice to this thrust? And subsequently, this paragraph was entirely removed from the draft convention. So I would like to know what would be your advice to those countries who put forth that argument. Thank you.
Okay, so what we could do then, we could work our way back. Yeah, would you be able to respond to that latter question in terms of your own experience?
No, and for a reason, because the United States does not participate in that particular discussion of that convention. So I will withhold my comment on that. If you'd like to speak about it afterwards, I'm happy to.
We certainly understand. And from your experience, would you be able to address that question?
Yeah, absolutely. So, how disappointing? Let me say that first of all. Because I think one of the reasons I brought us here today.
Want my mic?
Okay. Can you hear me now? Hello?
No.
So, yeah, great. I think it's rather disappointing that you would have such opposition to a statement that was meant and hinted at inclusion. I wasn't sure it was really inclusive, to be honest with you, because it says when it's relevant, when it's pertinent. You know, so first of all, I don't even know what that means. But here we are talking about, milestones and challenges of the Afro-Americas, and we're still having debates in this building about inclusive policies, inclusion of different groups, and I think it's disappointing. It shouldn't matter how many groups you include in that sentence. Indigenous, Afro, aliens from Mars, et cetera, et cetera. The whole point of that is that you want to show that you want to be inclusive, respectful of every single person's contribution. So in my view, if I was there at the meeting, they'd probably kick me out. Because I would resist, the exclusion of language like that. As a matter of fact, I think that language should be even made stronger.
Thank you so very much. Now, we had heard several points. I know that we have gone beyond the 5 o'clock, but I wish just to get your take on the following questions. There was a question of economic empowerment. There was the question of the importance of ensuring that the history of the achievements of black people, especially the Africans of Haiti, be recognized in the history of the hemisphere. And then we had the question of the identity. And we spoke about that earlier, how we impose chains upon our own minds and we become our own worst enemies. So feel free to address any one of those aspects that we have just touched on.
Can I make 3 final
Certainly,
comments?
yes.
And then we'll be finalizing. Number one, I'm very happy to see a number of Caribbean ambassadors here present. I want to acknowledge that because I think when we discuss issues related to people of African descent, the English-speaking Caribbean is somehow not a part of the discussion as much as we would like you to be. And I don't want to speak on behalf of all of the people of African descent in the Americas, but you have your own countries almost in some instances. And I think to many people in the region, the countries within the Caribbean are references, if for nothing else, for leadership, for becoming prime minister, becoming head of, becoming an ambassador. For many people, young people I speak to in Washington, the first ambassadors they saw of African descent were Caribbean ambassadors. The first presidents of countries that were black that they ever saw were from Africa. So how do we continue this dialogue and have more in common in the long run? I'd love to see us being more engaged throughout the region and sharing some of those best practices or good practices between us as a whole region, including Canada. I would also like to, in that discussion of Indo-racism or racism amongst ourselves, I think my previous observation still kind of follows that thread. I think there are a lot of people who don't see themselves as part of the larger 1/3 of people of African descent. And I think it would be helpful, perhaps as we spend more time exchanging with one another, speaking the same language. I think language is a big barrier in the region. If you look throughout the audience at the people of African descent from the United States or the Caribbean who work on these issues, almost all of us are trilingual. Almost all of us speak Spanish or speak Portuguese or speak French, and we read in other languages and we learn in other languages, and that allows us to have a greater sense of affinity with one another, because there are articles written in Spanish that a person in the United States will never read. There are books written in the United States that a person in Brazil will never read, merely because we don't speak or read the same language. So if I had a magic pot of money, it would probably go into interpretation and translation. And that leads to the third point, which was on identity.
The identity, the question of including the contributions of Haiti and of course the black people. And there was a question of, again, on whether or not governments are discriminated against in the Caribbean simply because.
Well, Haiti. Haiti is significant in this region. If you want to talk about human rights, it is a significant country in this region. Haiti is a significant country in the movement for negritude. Haiti is a significant country in the history of people of African descent in this hemisphere, if not in the world. And so I think that we have to be more cognizant of what we're teaching young people. We have to be more cognizant of what we're passing to our youth, and we have to learn more about the world around us. I think too many of us are living like this, and with blinders on. We don't know anything about the world outside. I won't speak for all countries, but in the United States, it's very difficult for young people to imagine leaving this country and learning anything else about anything else besides the little teeny place where you grew up is very difficult. How many people ever left their country? I was blessed to leave the United States and go to Colombia when I was 15. That changed my whole life. It changed my whole perspective. I was blessed to have parents that wanted me to see Senegal when I was 13. Changed my life. So how many young people have that opportunity to study abroad, to see people, to learn people, and to fellowship with people? We have so much in common as human beings, period. But especially within this particular community, I think we have a lot in common. And we know we don't get enough opportunity to discuss our commonalities without automatically having walls up of who are you and where are you from and why are you here and what do we have, why are you taking resources? It becomes that kind of conflict, I think, when you're ignorant of what the world is outside of your door.
And the experience of economic empowerment.
That's essential. Education is super important, and economic empowerment. We've just been having an experiment, and this is my last point, I promise, with the U.S.-Brazil Joint Action Plan to promote racial and ethnic equality. And one of the thematic areas where we're working is on this dialogue with Brazil is economic empowerment and the World Cup and Olympic Games. Who would have thought that we would be talking about how do you help to create opportunity in preparation for mega events? So we're having discussions and actions around how to prepare and build capacity for people to actually take part in what's going to change the landscape, economic landscape of a country. If people are marginalized and these events happen, they remain marginalized after those events happen. So how to utilize those events as a benchmark for social inclusion overall. And what we've done is compared lessons learned from the Atlanta Olympics in 1996, where some of the largest contracts were awarded to black women. How did it happen? And begin to really talk about how did that happen? Where was the state and local government in the consideration of contracting? How does the pipeline work? We're talking nuts and bolts discussion. How do you set up a pipeline to create a more diverse supply chain? So we can talk about those types of issues, and those things are concrete. Do you have the political will to take those observations and turn them into a reality in other places? We hope so. That's what.
Now, I've been given instruction that I have to wrap up. We've gone beyond our time. And I'm just so thrilled to see the energy in the room. I'm just so thrilled to see that this discussion has sparked so much interest. So this is just the beginning. It must be the beginning. We must build on this. And we want to ensure that we continue this discussion. Now, if you just, in a word, wrap up for me in terms of answering those questions in 90 seconds.
Sure. First, let me thank you for the opportunity. Again, thank the OAS and their team for this wonderful discussion. I want to close with Congressman Meeks' 3 words. He talked about education, he talked about economics, and he talked about empowerment. And I think, we all sit in this room and we know how important education is. So I don't want to talk too much to the choir about that. Economics, it is such a critical thing for our community. The reason why that language is so important, and the example that we just discussed about excluding the Afro community out of that language, we have several people here today from the state of Choco, from Colombia. If you take a plane from Medellin, which is a beautiful city, it won many awards for its architecture, and then you jump from Medellin to Quibdó in Choco, it's like you just went from night and day. It's a complete different world, 2 different worlds. But in Choco, there's a lot of mining. There's a lot of natural raw materials. And it's a black state. Well, why wouldn't somebody want a black state to control their own resources? It's economics. It goes down to money walks, money talks, right? So why wouldn't they want the language in there? Because if you control your resources in your state, you're able to invest in your community. So education, critical. You got to know these things. You got to know how they connect, right? You got to know the history. You got to know the past, right? Economics, it's a driver. We've got to become social players in our economy. And that is how we empower ourselves. The more we know, the more we understand, the more we organize ourselves, the more we work together, the stronger we can make these things occur.
And that is the last word. Would you please help me thank our panelists?
Thank you.
I now give the floor to the Executive Secretary of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights.
Thank you very much. And thank you, all of you, to be here. In behalf of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, I want to thank and make just remarks about the meeting, the round table that we have. Maybe you know, but the Commission presented this report, which is the situation of the people of African descent in the Americas. You can find out in our website. We have not enough copies because of our success. They are gone. No, but if you want to have a copy, you can access on the website. The rapporteurship on the rights of Afro-descendants and against racial discrimination is working in a new edition. So please join us in our website and promoting this report, and you will find some recommendations, some of the issues that you already talked about. There are a lot of discussion about the Americas and the situation, and there are particular recommendations on economics and cultural education, training, public policy. You will find out, in my opinion, a great job of the rapporteurship. And also I want to remark that this rapporteurship is working in three main things: capacity building, documentation, and promotion. So all of you who are working in these matters will find in the rapporteurship a source or ally or a partner for these projects. And I also want to let you know that we're going to have a public hearing about the situation in Afro-descendants, particularly in Colombia. So aquellos que vienen de Quibdó y de Chocó están muy cordialmente invitados a estar en la audiencia. Es una audiencia pública. Esta va a llevarse a cabo entre el 11 y el 16 de marzo. Les pido por favor que verifiquen en el website de la Comisión Interamericana de Derechos Humanos. Va a ser particularmente importante. Va a haber otra audiencia pública sobre Brasil. Y además, la Comisión estuvo en Colombia en diciembre. Yo personalmente tuve la gran oportunidad de estar en Quibdó. Pudimos viajar a Chocó y estamos haciendo parte del estudio, parte del informe que va a hacer la Comisión sobre eso. Si ustedes tienen material o sugerencias que nos quieran hacer llegar, serán muy bienvenidas. All of you that are working in Colombia, particularly, the Commission went in December in a visit in Loco. And we are working in a local visit report about Colombia. So those of you who are working with, we are very interested to talk to you and to have contact about this report that we're going to present soon. Finally, I want to let you know that the rapporteurship is also working in some issues, for example, with the United Nations Special Rapporteur, and we're going to have some workshop. We are working with some embassies. So as much as we can, we will organize these kind of meetings, roundtables, and presentations. Of course, there are some people who asked about the OES and economics and some projects in particularly. I will suggest that you should find Sherry Trust. She's new in office. The first gentleman who asked about who will be the partner in the OES. Sherry Trust is the Secretary for Social Development. She's working in some projects. I think she could be a very good contact. If you have no the information about, you can come to me or Hilaire Sobers, which is here. Well, he's Hilaire, and he can give you as much information as you need. And I just want to close because we are full of time. And I want to thank our moderator. Thank you very much, Ambassador. I want to bring an applause. And I also want to thank our panelists, Sayeka Carr Johnson and Francisco Lopez. Thank you very much. We are making visible the invisible, and we are making in a very positive way. And I think this is a part of a struggle of human rights. We fight very much for making these human rights become true. It's not only a question of legal framework and laws, it's a question of daily practice. It's a question of making reality rights for everyone. And I also want to thank all who make possible this roundtable. I want to thank the Secretariat of External Relations, to Jorge Sanin and Roberto Rojas. Thank you very much for your support. We really appreciate it. And I also want to thank Hilaire Sobers of the Commission. Thank you very much, Hilaire. To Maria Isabel Rivero and all the people in the Commission that supports this roundtable. I'm very happy with this first initiative. And also thank you, all of you who have a little time to share helps. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.